Between 1690 and 1725, a community of roughly 1,500 pirates ruled a stretch of coastline larger than England. Not Blackbeard, not Captain Kidd, not Henry Morgan or any of the names Hollywood turned into rum-soaked Halloween costumes. The men who built this place had no single famous name. They had a country. A real one, with laws, taxes, a standing army, and a king who crowned himself in a fortified compound on a hilltop in the middle of nowhere. The country was on the eastern coast of Madagascar, and the king's name was James Plantin. The British called it a nest. The French called it a problem. The Dutch tried to pretend it did not exist. And for nearly 3 decades it functioned as something no European empire was willing to admit out loud: a sovereign pirate state, complete with diplomats, treaties, and a navy that could intercept any merchant fleet between Cape Town and Calcutta. The Royal Navy sent expeditions. The East India Company sent investigators. Colonial governors from Bombay to the Cape wrote furious letters to London demanding action. And for 30 years, none of it worked. So how did a forgotten island off the coast of Africa become the most successful pirate experiment in recorded history? How did a Jamaican-born common sailor end up crowning himself king of a stretch of jungle that no European map even bothered to label? And why is it that the most ambitious criminal nation ever built has no monument, no flag in any museum, no chapter in any school textbook? To understand that, we need to start with a map. Not the map you know. The map that the merchants of London, Lisbon, and Amsterdam pretended not to look at when they bought their insurance. Picture the Indian Ocean in the 1690s. On the western edge, the coast of East Africa, Mombasa, Zanzibar, Mozambique. On the northern edge, the Arabian Peninsula, funneling pilgrims and gold toward Mecca every year in convoys that carried more wealth than most kingdoms. On the eastern edge, the Mughal Empire of India, silk, spice, gemstones, the richest civilization on earth. And running through the middle of it all, the great trade arteries connecting Europe to Asia. Dutch East Indiamen carrying nutmeg and pepper, English ships hauling tea and cotton, Portuguese vessels still clinging to the old spice routes, French traders pushing into the eastern oceans for the first time. Every leg of that ocean was money. Staggering, world-shaping money. Ships moved so much wealth through these waters that a single captured vessel could make a man richer than a duke for life. And in the dead center of it all, sitting like an enormous stepping stone between Africa and India, was the island of Madagascar. The 4th largest island in the world, mountainous, jungled, fever-ridden, and almost completely ignored by every European power. The Portuguese had tried to settle it in the 1500s and lost most of their men to disease. The French had attempted a colony at Fort Dauphin in the south and watched it collapse into massacre and abandonment by 1674. The British looked at it, calculated the cost of tamming the place, and decided their effort was better spent in India. Madagascar was the one piece of strategically perfect real estate that no empire wanted to pay for, which meant it was empty, which meant it was available, and the men who eventually filled that vacuum were not soldiers or settlers. They were the leftovers of every war Europe had finished fighting. That coastline was their hunting ground. The hilltop at Ranter Bay was the throne room, and the man who eventually sat on it never set out to be a king at all. In the late 1690s, the Atlantic Ocean was full of unemployed killers. The 9 Years' War had ended in 1697, and tens of thousands of privateers, men who had spent the previous decade legally robbing French and Spanish ships under royal commissions, suddenly found themselves out of work. The crowns of Europe wanted them gone. The merchants of Europe wanted them hanged, and the men themselves wanted only one thing: to keep doing what they were already good at, in waters where the law could not reach them. They drifted east, around the Cape of Good Hope, up the coast of East Africa, and one by one they discovered Madagascar. The first arrivals were small crews, 20, 30 men to a ship, looking for a place to careen their hulls and resupply between raids on the Red Sea pilgrim fleets. They found protected bays on the eastern coast. They found freshwater rivers, abundant game, and Malagasy clans who were willing to trade food and labor for muskets and iron. Most importantly, they found that no European warship was going to chase them this far. The Royal Navy was overextended in the Atlantic. The Dutch were busy in the Spice Islands. The French were rebuilding after a bankrupting war. Madagascar was, for all practical purposes, a place where empire ended. By 1700, there were small pirate settlements scattered along the eastern coast and on the offshore island of Isle Sainte-Marie. Crews lived in palm-thatched huts. They traded with local kings. They took Malagasy wives and fathered children who grew up speaking two languages. The settlements had no formal leader, no flag, no laws beyond the articles each crew had signed aboard its own ship. It was less a country than a constellation of hideouts. And into this loose, leaderless world in the second decade of the new century walked a man named James Plantin. He was born in Jamaica around 1690, the son of English settlers who had come to the colony for the same reason everyone came to Jamaica: sugar, rum, the chance to claw a fortune out of a place that killed most of the people who tried. Plantin went to sea young, the way all poor Jamaican boys did, and worked his way through the merchant trade and the privateer trade, and eventually drifted east in the great post-war migration of unemployed sailors. He was, by every account, ordinary. A competent navigator, a decent fighter, not famous, not feared, not the kind of man anyone expected to become a king. He arrived at Ranter Bay sometime around 1715. The settlement there was struggling. 2 of the original pirate captains had died of fever. A third had sailed for India and never returned. The remaining men were drifting, drinking, fighting among themselves, watching their fortified compound collapse around them as the jungle reclaimed the cleared ground. Plantin looked at the place and saw something the others had missed. He did not see a hideout. He saw a capital. He did not seize Ranter Bay. He organized it. He convinced the surviving pirates that what they had built, accidentally, over the previous 20 years, was a country in everything but name, and that all it needed was a center of gravity. He rebuilt the hilltop fort. He cleared the surrounding land. He cut deals with the nearest Malagasy clan, the Antiviratra, and married into their nobility a daughter of a local chief whose name has been lost to history, but whose alliance gave Plantin something no European pirate had ever managed before: legitimacy in the land itself. And then, in a gesture that should have been laughable but somehow was not, he crowned himself king of Ranter Bay. The exact words of the declaration have not survived. What survived is the practical fact that within 2 years of his arrival, every pirate crew operating in the western Indian Ocean acknowledged Plantin as the authority of the coast, and every Malagasy clan within 3 days' march of the bay had signed some form of treaty with him. He was not a king the way Louis XIV was a king. He was a king the way a man becomes a king when there is nobody else around to tell him he is not one. And in the empty space that European empires had left at the edge of the world, that was apparently enough. His first act as king was the act that would define the next 10 years. He did not raid more ships, he taxed them. Most pirates of the era thought in terms of single voyages. Sail out, find a fat merchant, take what you can carry, run for a hideout, drink the proceeds, repeat. It was an exhausting, dangerous, short-term way to live, and it was why most pirate careers ended within 3 or 4 years, either at the end of a rope or at the bottom of the sea. Plantin thought differently. He understood something that no Caribbean pirate had ever quite grasped. A safe harbor in the right location was worth more than 100 captured ships, because every pirate in the Indian Ocean needed somewhere to careen, resupply, sell plunder, and rest. And if you controlled the only friendly port on the most strategically important coastline in the Eastern Hemisphere, you did not need to chase anyone. They came to you. He turned Ranter Bay into the only safe harbor for pirates between the Cape of Good Hope and the Malabar coast. Crews arrived with captured cargo and exchanged it for fresh water, livestock, repaired sails, gunpowder, and women. Plantin took a percentage of everything. He provided protection inside the harbor and refused entry to any crew that would not pay his tariffs. He had, in effect, invented a tax code for piracy. Within 3 years, he was wealthier than most of the colonial governors who were writing furious dispatches about him. He owned warehouses full of silk and spice. He had personal guards drawn from both European pirates and Malagasy warriors. He kept a private fleet of 3 ships at anchor in the bay at all times, not for raiding, but as a standing navy to enforce his authority. And he had never personally fired a shot in anger since the day he arrived. This was the pattern that would define the Madagascar kingdom for the rest of its existence. Patience, infrastructure, geography, taxation, the boring foundations of every successful state in human history, applied to a criminal enterprise by a man who had probably never read a book in his life, but understood power the way a carpenter understands wood. To understand how the kingdom actually worked, you have to understand the hilltop. Ranter Bay sat on the northeastern coast of Madagascar, in a sheltered inlet protected by reefs and steep headlands. The bay itself could hold a dozen ships at anchor in deep water, hidden from any vessel passing offshore. Above the bay rose a forested hill, and on top of that hill, Plantin built his fortified compound. The fort was not impressive by European standards. Earthen ramparts faced with timber, a wooden palisade, 6 cannons mounted in fixed positions, a central longhouse where Plantin held court, surrounded by smaller buildings for his guards, his wives, his children, and the storehouses where the kingdom's wealth was kept. By the standards of a French or English fortress, it was a joke. By the standards of what was needed to control eastern Madagascar in 1720, it was overkill. What made the place dangerous was not the walls. It was the orientation of the guns. Plantin had pointed his cannons inland. Every European fort in the colonial world pointed its guns at the sea, expecting attack from rival empires. Plantin pointed his guns at the jungle, because he understood that the European empires were never going to reach him. The threat was the interior of Madagascar itself, the powerful inland kingdoms, the Sakalava in the west and the Marina in the central highlands, who were watching the foreign settlements on the coast with growing interest. Plantin's guns were a message to them. Come if you wish, the first wave will die on the slope. Inside the compound, the kingdom ran on a strange hybrid of pirate democracy and personal monarchy. Every major decision was put to a vote of the senior pirates, as it would have been on any well-run ship. The articles of the original Ranter Bay community were written, signed, and updated every few years. Every man received a share of the harbor tariffs in proportion to his rank and length of service. Disputes were settled in open court, with Plantin serving as judge but bound by precedent. The men who had spent their lives under the lash of European naval discipline had built something that resembled, more than anything else, a small republic with a ceremonial king at its head. And the king himself was a careful theatrical performance. Plantin wore European coats trimmed with Malagasy beadwork. He spoke English, broken French, and enough of the local dialect to negotiate with his in-laws without an interpreter. He kept 3 wives, all daughters of allied Malagasy chiefs, in deliberate political marriages that bound his kingdom to 3 separate clans. He fathered at least 9 children that history can document, and probably many more it cannot. He dined on French wine when he could get it and palm toddy when he could not. He owned a gold-hilted sword that he never carried into the field, because the point of the sword was not to fight. The point of the sword was to be seen. Visitors who came to Ranter Bay in the early 1720s left descriptions that read like something out of a fever dream. A court of tattooed European pirates and old African warriors standing side by side. Children running between them speaking a Creole no outsider could follow. Mogul silver and Spanish gold and Persian carpets piled in storehouses next to bundles of dried fish and stacks of muskets. A king on a wooden chair receiving merchants and ambassadors, and offering them rum from a silver cup that had belonged to a Portuguese governor 3 sea voyages ago. It should not have worked. It worked anyway. For one full generation it worked beautifully. By 1720, the Madagascar kingdom was at its peak, and the consequences were rippling all the way back to London. The pirate fleet operating out of Ranter Bay and Isle Sainte-Marie had grown to somewhere between 40 and 60 active vessels, depending on the season. Most were small sloops and brigantines suited for hit-and-run raids, but several were captured East Indiamen of substantial size, refitted with extra guns and crews of 100 or more. Together, they could project force across an area of ocean roughly equal to the western Mediterranean. They hit Mughal pilgrim fleets returning from Mecca, taking treasure that had been gathered from across the entire Islamic world. They intercepted Dutch East Indiamen carrying spices from Java. They captured French slavers and English merchant vessels and Arab dhows running gold from Sofala. In a single year, by conservative estimates, the Madagascar pirates took more wealth out of the Indian Ocean trade than any European colony produced in the same period. The Mughal emperor wrote furious letters to the English ambassador in Delhi, demanding that London do something about the pirate kingdom that was robbing his subjects. The East India Company, terrified of losing its trading privileges in India, sent panicked dispatches to the Admiralty. The Dutch East India Company calculated its losses and began rerouting entire fleets to avoid the eastern Madagascar coast. Insurance rates for Indian Ocean voyages tripled between 1715 and 1722. The kingdom had its own informal currency by this point, a mixture of Spanish silver, Mughal rupees, and gold dust weighed on small scales kept in every Ranter Bay tavern. It had its own laws, enforced by Plantain's court. It had a small standing army of perhaps 200 Malagasy warriors paid directly from the harbor tariffs. It had diplomatic relations of a sort with 3 inland kingdoms and active hostility with 2 others. It received foreign visitors, including at least one English merchant captain who wrote in his journal that he had been received at the court of the King of Ranter Bay, and treated with more courtesy than he had ever received from a European colonial governor. It was, by any honest measure, a sovereign nation. The only reason it did not appear on any official map was that admitting it existed would have required the European empires to also admit that they could not destroy it, so they pretended it was not there. They wrote about infestations and nests and the Madagascar problem, and they sent the occasional expedition that always returned with vague reports of having seen nothing of importance. The kingdom continued. The taxes were collected. The cannons remained pointed at the jungle. And then slowly, the world began to close in. The problem that eventually destroyed the Madagascar kingdom was not the one anyone had been expecting. It was not the Royal Navy. It was not the East India Company. It was not even the inland Malagasy kingdoms, though they would play their part. The problem was time itself, and 3 slow killers that no fortress can defend against. The first killer was disease. Madagascar in the 1720s was one of the deadliest disease environments on Earth for Europeans. Malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, and a half-dozen tropical fevers that had no names yet. The pirates who had built the kingdom were aging. Most were in their 40s or 50s by 1725, which was old age for men who had spent their lives at sea, and they had no replacements. Every year, more died of fever than were born into the community. The hilltop court grew thinner. The bay held fewer ships. The taverns in Ranter Bay began to have empty tables. The second killer was politics. The inland kingdoms of Madagascar had been watching the coast for 30 years, and they were no longer patient. The Sakalava in the west had unified under a powerful king who had no interest in foreign settlers on his eastern flank. The Marina in the highlands were rising under a new dynasty that would eventually conquer most of the island. Plantain's marriages had bought him peace with 3 small coastal clans, but those clans were themselves being absorbed by larger powers, and the larger powers did not feel bound by his treaties. Raids on outlying pirate farms became more frequent. Trade caravans from the interior arrived less often. The cannons pointed at the jungle were still loaded, but the men behind them were getting older, and there were fewer of them every year. The third killer was the closing of the Atlantic. After 1722, the golden age of piracy in the Caribbean and along the American coast ended. The Royal Navy had broken the back of the Atlantic pirate communities. Bartholomew Roberts was dead. His fleet was dispersed. The hangings at Cape Coast Castle had made an example of the survivors, and the steady stream of unemployed European sailors looking for somewhere to go had dried up. Madagascar had been built on a constant influx of new pirates from the Atlantic. When that pipeline closed, the kingdom began to age out, with no young men arriving to replace the old ones dying of fever. By 1727, the population of European pirates in eastern Madagascar had fallen from its peak of around 1,500 to perhaps 400. The fleet had shrunk to a dozen active ships. The harbor at Ranter Bay was still defensible, but there were not enough men left to crew the cannons on the hill and the ships in the bay at the same time. Plantin found himself running a kingdom that was slowly dissolving underneath him, and there was no enemy to fight, no battle to win, nothing to point his guns at. The jungle was not attacking. The sea was not attacking. The kingdom was simply running out of people. He made his decision, by all accounts, in late 1728. He gathered what wealth he could carry. Gold, silver, jewels accumulated over a decade of harbor taxes. He said farewell to his Malagasy wives and his children, leaving them in the care of their maternal clans, where they would be raised as Malagasy nobility rather than as the children of a foreign king. He boarded a captured Dutch ship in the bay, took with him a small crew of his most loyal men, and sailed east. The last reliable record places him on the western coast of India sometime in 1729, attempting to take service with one of the warring Maratha princes who was hiring European mercenaries to fight the Mughals. After that, the historical trail goes cold. He may have died in India. He may have lived to old age under a different name. He may have been killed in a battle nobody bothered to record. No grave has ever been found. No memoir was ever written. The king of Ranter Bay simply walked off the edge of the documented world and disappeared. The kingdom did not collapse in any dramatic moment. It dissolved. Without Plantin's central authority, the remaining pirates at Ranter Bay drifted apart. Some sailed for India and the Persian Gulf, looking for one last score. Some sailed for the Caribbean, where most of them were caught and hanged within 2 years. Most simply stayed. They were old. They had Malagasy wives and Malagasy children. They had no homes left in Europe and no welcome left in any colony. They moved off the fortified hilltop and down into the villages of their in-laws, and they spent their last years as elderly foreigners married into local clans. Their children grew up Malagasy. Their grandchildren forgot the language their grandfathers had spoken. The European bloodlines blended into the Antavaratra and the Betsimisaraka and a dozen other coastal peoples, and within 3 generations, nobody on the eastern coast of Madagascar remembered that their great-grandfather had been a pirate from Bristol or Marseille or Boston. The names changed. The faces changed. The pale skin and red hair persisted as occasional anomalies in coastal villages, and people shrugged and said nothing about it. The fortified hill at Ranter Bay was abandoned by 1735. The wooden palisade rotted in the rain. The earthen ramparts slumped back into the soil. The cannons that had pointed at the jungle were taken by passing chiefs and used in inland wars until they wore out and were thrown into rivers. The longhouse where Plantin had held court collapsed in a storm sometime in the 1740s and was never rebuilt. By 1760, the only sign that a kingdom had ever existed on that hilltop was a patch of cleared ground that grew back into forest a little faster than the surrounding jungle, because the soil was still salted with charcoal and broken pottery. On the offshore island of Isle Sainte-Marie, the pirate cemetery remained. Stone gravestones carved with skulls and crossbones, marking the burials of pirates who had died of fever or violence or simple old age in the decades when the kingdom had been alive. The graves were never moved. Nobody knew who most of the men had been. The names on the stones were carved in English and French, and a few in languages nobody could identify, and the stones leaned at increasing angles as the wet soil shifted beneath them year after year. The cemetery is still there. The stones are still leaning. The jungle has grown around them and over some of them, and tourists who visit the island today are told that this is where the pirates of Madagascar are buried. None of the stones bears the name James Planten. He is not there. He is somewhere in India, or somewhere in an unmarked grave in a country nobody recorded. The Madagascar kingdom never went to war with any European power. It was never conquered. It was never defeated in any battle. It simply outlived its own conditions and faded into the landscape it had been built on, leaving behind a few leaning gravestones, a few stories nobody wrote down, and a bloodline that ran through the coastal villages of an island that pretended not to remember it. And the irony is staggering. The most successful pirate community in recorded history, a community that lasted 30 years, controlled an area larger than England, intercepted more wealth than any colony produced, and built functioning democratic institutions in defiance of every empire on Earth, is barely a footnote in popular culture. Blackbeard, who terrorized the American coast for 2 years before being killed in a swamp, got movies and theme parks and Halloween costumes. Captain Kidd, who was hanged in London after a single disastrous voyage, got ballads sung about him for 2 centuries. Henry Morgan, who eventually became a colonial governor, got his name on a brand of rum. The men who built a kingdom got nothing. No movies, no songs, no monuments, a few academic papers and a few paragraphs in obscure histories, and the leaning gravestones on Isle Sainte-Marie that almost nobody visits. Part of the reason is that the Madagascar story does not fit the pirate stereotype. There was no charismatic captain with a flag of his own design. There was no spectacular battle. There was no famous death. Planten was not Blackbeard. He did not braid burning fuses into his beard. He did not fight to the last man on a smoking deck. He was a patient administrator who built a tax system in a place where no government had thought to put one. And that is not the kind of story that gets made into a film. The other part of the reason is that the Madagascar story is uncomfortable. It is the story of a criminal enterprise that worked, that built something real, that was not destroyed by virtue or law or the righteous arm of empire, but by mosquitoes and time and the slow forgetting of grandchildren. It suggests that the European empires which eventually ruled the world were not actually capable of stamping out every alternative to themselves. It suggests that for one full generation, on the edge of the known world, a different kind of society existed, and it functioned, and it would have kept functioning if biology had been on its side. That is not a story that fits comfortably into any national mythology, so it was allowed to fade, the way the kingdom itself faded, into a footnote and a leaning gravestone and the half-forgotten memory of a coastline where the cannons used to point at the jungle. His body was never recovered. His gold was never found. His descendants forgot his name within 3 generations, and the kingdom he built on a hilltop at the edge of the known world drifted into history, attached to the ghost of a Jamaican sailor who became, for a little while, the most successful king nobody ever heard of. If this is the kind of history that keeps you watching, hit subscribe. I cover stories like this every week, the ones the textbooks skipped and Hollywood ignored. And if you want to know about another pirate kingdom that was even stranger than this one, a place where the pirates wrote their own constitution before the United States existed, that video is on screen right now.